Reading to question. Critical Reading Chapter 1, The Three Layers of Comprehension. Subchapter 1, Literal Comprehension, Understanding What is Said. Before you can judge what a text implies, and long before you can judge whether it is true, you have to be able to say, plainly and accurately, what it says. That sounds almost too simple to be worth a whole section. Many readers, especially adults, assume they have already mastered it. They can pronounce the words. They can finish the paragraph. They can tell you the topic. Yet when you ask them to restate the author's point in a single clean sentence, their answer slides sideways. It adds something the author never said. It leaves out a key condition. It smuggles in an opinion. Or it replaces the author's claim with a vague summary like, it's about how society is changing. Literal comprehension is the discipline of staying inside the boundaries of the text. It is not the whole of reading, but it is the floor. If the floor is uneven, every higher skill wobbles. Think of critical reading as a courtroom skill, not a mood. In a courtroom, you cannot cross-examine a witness based on what you wish they had said. You have to quote them accurately. You have to separate testimony from interpretation. Literal comprehension is that skill applied to print. You can point to the sentence, show what it asserts, and distinguish it from what you inferred, assumed, or felt. This is why many arguments, online and in person, go nowhere. Two people think they disagree about the truth, but they have not even agreed on what the text claims. One person is arguing with a sentence that is not on the page. The other is defending a position the author never took. The result is heat without light. Literal comprehension has a few core tasks. None of them are glamorous, and all of them matter. First, identify what the text is literally about and do it with the author's categories, not yours. If an article is about inflation expectations and you keep calling it prices going up, you may be close enough for casual conversation, but you may miss the point. Inflation expectations are not the same thing as inflation itself. A skilled reader notices that difference because the author chose those words for a reason. Second, track who did what to whom. This is the grammar of meaning. Many comprehension failures are not about vocabulary at all. They are about relationships in a sentence. Consider the difference between the committee recommended the policy and the committee recommended that the policy be reviewed. In the first, the committee is endorsing. In the second, the committee is not endorsing, it is suggesting scrutiny. A reader who compresses both into the committee supported the policy has not done literal comprehension. They have done a sloppy paraphrase that changes the claim. Third, distinguish the main claim from supporting details. Authors often wrap their central point in examples, anecdotes, side notes, and clarifications. If you cannot tell what is central, you cannot evaluate it later. One of the simplest ways to test this is to ask the following. If I had to summarize the text in one sentence to someone who will never read it, what sentence would do the least damage? If your sentence is a detail, you have not found the spine. Fourth, notice qualifiers, conditions, and scope. These are the small words that control the size of a claim. Some, many, often, may, in this context, for most people, and under these conditions. Weak readers ignore them. Strong readers treat them like the load-bearing beams of the argument. Exercise improves mood is not the same claim as exercise may improve mood for some people in the short term. If you drop the may and the for some people, you have turned a cautious statement into a universal one, and you will later criticize the author for overclaiming even though the author did not. Fifth, keep track of definitions. In serious writing, key terms are often defined in a specific way that may differ from everyday usage. Literal comprehension means accepting the definition for the purpose of understanding what the author is doing, even if you dislike it. You can argue later about whether the definition is fair. But first, you must be able to say, in this text, the author uses this term to mean this. This matters especially in civic and professional reading, which this book will return to again and again. When someone writes about equity, do they mean fairness, equal outcomes, equal access, or something else? When someone writes risk, do they mean probability, severity, or a mixture? When someone writes evidence, do they mean randomized trials, personal testimony, historical records, or plausible mechanisms? Literal comprehension forces you to pin these down. It is how you prevent yourself from shadowboxing with your own associations. A practical way to build literal comprehension is to separate three layers in your own notes: quotations, paraphrases, and reactions. Quotations are exact words from the text, used sparingly, usually for key claims or definitions. Paraphrases are restatements in your own words that do not add meaning. Reactions are your thoughts, agreements, disagreements, memories, and questions. Many readers merge these into one stream, and then they are surprised when they cannot tell what the author said versus what they thought. If you are working with children, this separation is even more powerful. You can literally label a page text, my words, or my thoughts. But adults benefit too, especially when reading emotionally charged material. When a topic triggers you, you tend to jump straight from a sentence to a conclusion. Literal comprehension is the pause that keeps you honest. Another practice is the one-sentence anchor. After each paragraph, force yourself to write one sentence that states the paragraph's function. Not what it reminds you of, not whether you agree, but what it does. Is it making a claim, giving evidence, defining a term, providing an example, offering a counter-argument? If you cannot name the function, you probably did not understand the paragraph's role in the whole. You should also train yourself to notice signal words. Authors tell you what they are doing if you pay attention. Words like however, therefore, for example, in contrast, because, as a result, although, and on the other hand. These are the hinges of the argument. Miss them, and you will flip the meaning. Although is a warning that what follows is not a simple continuation, it may be a limitation. Therefore tells you a conclusion is being drawn. Literal comprehension includes being able to point to the therefore and say, this is the conclusion. Everything before it is supposed to support it. This is where many readers, including fluent readers, get into trouble with sentence complexity. A long sentence with multiple clauses can feel like a fog. The solution is not to give up and skim. It is to unpack the sentence. Find the subject and verb of the main clause. Then, locate subordinate clauses and ask what they modify. You do not need to diagram sentences like an old grammar textbook, but you do need the habit of slowing down when the meaning depends on structure. Consider a sentence like, while the policy reduced short-term costs, it increased long-term maintenance burdens in districts that lacked stable funding. A rushed reader might remember, the policy reduced costs and stop there. But the real claim is balanced, reduced short-term costs and increased long-term burdens, specifically in certain districts. Literal comprehension preserves all three parts. Notice also that literal comprehension does not mean believing. It means accurately representing. You can understand a claim perfectly and still think it is wrong. In fact, if you cannot state the claim in a way the author would recognize, you are not ready to challenge it. One mark of integrity in reading is being able to say, here's the strongest, fairest version of what the author is saying, before you say, here's why I think it fails. This is not just a moral posture, it is a practical one. Misreading wastes time. It makes you argue against weaker claims than the ones actually presented, which gives you the false feeling of being smart. It also prevents learning. You cannot learn from a text you are not really reading. Literal comprehension has an enemy that hides behind confidence, the illusion of understanding. When a text uses familiar words in a familiar tone, we assume we are tracking it. But comprehension is not a feeling, it is a performance. Can you paraphrase the claim without changing it? Can you answer a basic right there question, where the answer is explicitly stated? Can you point to the sentence that supports your answer? These are the kinds of questions Pearson and Johnson highlighted decades ago, and they matter because they reveal whether the text actually entered your mind or merely flowed past it. If you find yourself thinking, this is obvious, test yourself anyway. Write the author's claim in one sentence. Add the key qualifiers. Identify one sentence that serves as evidence or support, even if it is weak. Name one term the author uses in a specialized way. Then, and only then, move on to what the text implies and what you make of it. Critical reading begins later in the chapter, but it begins safely only here, with humility about the page. Literal comprehension is the promise you make to the author and to yourself. I will not distort you before I dispute you. I will not decorate you before I dismiss you. I will first understand what is said, then I will read between the lines. Then I will decide what is true. Subchapter 2. Inferential comprehension, reading between the lines. Once you can stay inside the boundaries of what the text says, the next layer of comprehension begins to tug you outside the quotation marks. Not outside the text, exactly, but outside its explicit statements. Inferential comprehension is what you do when the author does not hand you every connection, every motive, every consequence, every missing step. It is how you read between the lines without making things up. This is the point where many readers, including capable adults, either become timid or reckless. The timid reader treats only explicit statements as real, as if the author's meaning is limited to sentences that look like they belong on a definition card. The reckless reader treats every reaction as an insight. If a friend says, "I tried calling you twice," they may also be implying, "I needed you," or "I was worried," or "I'm a little annoyed you didn't answer." They do not have to say those words for you to pick them up. In fact, if you respond only to the literal content, you will seem strangely obtuse. Yes, you called twice. Reading works the same way. Authors routinely rely on your ability to connect dots. Inferential comprehension begins with a simple truth. Texts are compressed. Even long books cannot state everything. Writers leave out steps because they assume their audience can fill them in. Sometimes they leave them out because they do not realize they are leaving them out. Sometimes they leave them out because stating them openly would weaken their case. A critical reader needs the ability to infer in all three situations, and then later, in the critical layer, to judge whether the inference is fair. One way to keep inference honest is to treat it like a courtroom move, continuing the metaphor from literal comprehension. Literal comprehension was quoting the witness accurately. Inferential comprehension is noticing what follows from the testimony. If the witness says, "I saw the man run from the building and then I heard glass break," you might infer a sequence, a relationship, a likely cause. But a responsible attorney does not infer anything whatsoever. They infer what the testimony supports, and they can explain how they got there. In reading, that explanation often takes the form of a small sentence you can say to yourself. Because the author said X and Y, it suggests Z. If you cannot fill in the because, your inference is probably a projection. Pearson and Johnson's question-answer relationships are useful here because they name the shift. Some questions are right there, with answers explicitly on the page. Some are think and search, where you gather clues across sentences or paragraphs. But the inferential layer often lives in what they called author and you questions. The author provides part of the answer, and you supply the rest from general knowledge, logic, or a sense of how the world works. This is where comprehension becomes active, construction rather than extraction. Consider a simple example. A text says, "After the new schedule was introduced, absenteeism declined for 3 months. By midwinter, it rose again." The author may never state, "The schedule change had only a temporary effect," but that is a reasonable inference. Or you might infer, "Seasonal illness likely influenced the midwinter rise," depending on context. Notice what you are doing. You are combining the text with background knowledge about time, seasons, and cause and effect patterns. Later chapters will make the uncomfortable point that background knowledge is not optional. Here, you can already see it. Without some knowledge of how the world tends to work, you cannot read between the lines. You can only stare at lines. Inference is not one skill. It is a family of small moves. The most common are these. First, bridging inferences, connecting one sentence to the next so the text stays coherent. If the author writes, "Maria dropped the beaker," the lab went silent, you infer that the beaker broke, that the break was loud, or that something dangerous may have spilled. The text does not specify, but the silence makes sense only if something happened that drew attention. Bridging inferences are so automatic for skilled readers that they do not notice them. Struggling readers often fail here, which is why a story can feel like a pile of disconnected statements. Second, pronoun and reference inferences, keeping track of who he, she, they, this, and that refer to. This may sound literal, but it often becomes inferential when references are indirect or delayed. This outcome might refer to a result described 2 paragraphs earlier. A reader who loses track cannot build a stable model of what is happening. Third, causal inferences, noticing implied cause, motive, or mechanism. If an author writes, "The city raised parking fees," downtown businesses reported fewer walk-in customers. Many readers infer a causal link even if the author never says because. Sometimes that link is plausible. Sometimes it is a classic confusion between correlation and causation. But you cannot evaluate it critically if you do not first notice that the author is inviting you to connect them. Fourth, emotional and social inferences, deducing relationships, attitudes, and stakes. When a narrator says he smiled and said, "Of course," you infer tone. Is it sincere, bitter, defeated? The author may provide cues elsewhere. In civic and professional texts, the tone is often formal, but emotional inference still matters. What does the author seem worried about, proud of, impatient with, or eager to persuade you of? Fifth, scope and implication inferences. What follows if the author's claim is true? This is where inferential comprehension begins to touch critical comprehension, but it is still distinct. If a report argues that a certain intervention modestly increases graduation rates, you may infer policy consequences, funding decisions, changes in staffing, and shifts in curriculum. The author might not list these, but they may be implied by the way the claim is framed. A skilled reader does these moves while staying tethered to the text. That tether is what prevents inference from turning into fantasy. You saw earlier the practice of separating quotations, paraphrases, and reactions. Inferential notes deserve their own label too, especially when you are learning what the text suggests. This keeps you honest. It also keeps you flexible because inferences are revisable. You should be able to say, "I inferred this at first, but later the author added information that changed it." This revisability is one of the most important habits in the entire book. Poor readers treat inferences as instant conclusions. Strong readers treat them as provisional scaffolding, useful for comprehension but always subject to correction. When you build a mental model of a text, you are constantly making small bets about what the author means. You place the bets, you keep reading, and you update. That is also why inference is inseparable from attention to signal words, which you practiced in literal comprehension. Words like therefore, however, although, because, and as a result are not just logical connectors, they are inference instructions. However tells you to adjust the model you have in your head. Therefore tells you a conclusion is coming, and you should ask what supports it. Although tells you not to overgeneralize. Skilled readers treat these words like road signs. Struggling readers read them as decoration and then wonder why they get lost. Inference failures tend to cluster in predictable ways. One failure is over-inference, adding meaning that is not supported. A reader sees the CEO declined to comment and infers he is guilty. That may be possible, but it is not guaranteed. The stronger inference is simply the CEO chose not to make a public statement. Anything beyond that requires more evidence. Another failure is under-inference, refusing to connect what the author clearly expects you to connect. A student reads, "The ground was slick and the runner's time suffered," and does not infer that slipping slowed the runner. This often looks like not paying attention, but it is frequently a knowledge problem. If you have never run on ice, slick may not carry the right consequence in your mind. You cannot infer what you cannot imagine. A third failure is biased inference, inferring in the direction of what you already believe. Two readers can read the same sentence. The agency revised its guidelines and infer opposite motives. They are correcting past mistakes versus they are caving to pressure. Often the text provides subtle cues that support one more than the other, but a reader's prior commitments can overpower those cues. This is one of the bridges to later chapters on cynicism and tribalism, but it begins here, quietly, in the small unseen conclusions you draw as you read. So how do you teach yourself or a child to infer well? Start with the simplest discipline. Make the inference explicit and point to the clues. A good inference is not just an answer. It is an answer with receipts. If you are working with children, you can ask, "What in the text makes you think that?" With adults, the question is the same, just phrased with dignity. Which sentence led you to that conclusion? If the only support is "it feels like," you may be dealing with projection rather than inference. Another practice is to ask targeted inference questions that cannot be answered by quoting a line, but also cannot be answered by pure opinion. For example, what does the author assume the reader already knows here? What problem is this example meant to solve? What does the author expect to happen next, given what they've described? These questions train the mind to look for implied structure. You can also slow inference down by using a two-column method, clues from the text on one side and what I infer on the other. This works especially well with persuasive writing, where the author may rely on unstated steps. When you do this, you often discover that the author's argument feels persuasive, partly because your mind generously filled gaps. That is not a reason to stop inferring. It is a reason to notice when you are doing it. Inferential comprehension, at its best, is not suspicious or cynical. It is generous, but not gullible. It assumes the author is communicating a coherent meaning, and it works to reconstruct that meaning from what is said and what must be meant for the text to make sense. In the next layer, critical comprehension, you will begin to ask whether the reconstructed meaning deserves your belief. But you cannot judge what you have not built. First, you must assemble the implied message with care. Literal comprehension was the promise. I will not distort you before I dispute you. Inferential comprehension adds a second promise. I will not flatten you into only what you happen to spell out. Many texts, especially serious ones, do their real work in the space between sentences. If you cannot read that space, you cannot truly read the text at all. Subchapter 3, Critical Comprehension, Deciding What to Make of It. Inferential comprehension ends with a meaning that is not directly stated but is strongly supported by what is stated. Critical comprehension begins when you ask a different question. All right, but should I believe it? And if I should not fully believe it, what should I do with it instead? This is the layer most people mean when they say they want to be critical thinkers, but it is also the layer most often misunderstood. Many readers treat critical as a mood, suspicious, combative, quick to spot flaws. Others treat it as a personality trait. Some people are naturally critical, and others are naturally trusting. In this book, critical comprehension is neither a mood nor a trait. It is a discipline. It is the habit of holding a claim open while you test it. That phrase matters, holding a claim open. If you accept a claim too quickly, you become credulous. If you reject it too quickly, you become cynical. Both are forms of intellectual laziness, just in different directions. Critical comprehension is the refusal to do either one. It is the mental posture that says, I can represent what the author said accurately, I can infer what they meant, and now I will evaluate whether the meaning is warranted. Notice what has to happen first. You cannot evaluate fairly if you have not done the earlier layers with integrity. Literal comprehension was the promise. I will not distort you before I dispute you. Inferential comprehension added, I will not flatten you into only what you happen to spell out. Critical comprehension adds a third promise. I will not give you my belief just because you are printed, and I will not deny you my belief just because I dislike you. A courtroom metaphor still helps, but we have to extend it. Literal comprehension was quoting the witness accurately. Inferential comprehension was noticing what follows from the testimony. Critical comprehension is cross-examination and deliberation. Cross-examination does not mean yelling gotcha. It means testing reliability. Is the witness in a position to know? Are they consistent? Are they leaving something out? Deliberation does not mean cynically assuming everyone lies. It means weighing what has been presented against other evidence and against what you know about how the world works. This is where many reading programs stop being explicit. They teach students to summarize, to identify main ideas, to make inferences, and then they gesture vaguely toward thinking critically. But critical comprehension is not vague. It has specific questions, and it requires particular kinds of knowledge and honesty. Start with the simplest critical question. What is the author's main claim exactly, and how strong is it? This sounds like literal comprehension, but it is not. Literal comprehension asks, what did the author say? Critical comprehension asks, what is the author asking me to believe? Those are not always the same thing. Writers often present information that looks neutral, but is arranged to push you toward a conclusion. The claim might be explicit, signaled by therefore or this shows. but it might also be implied by what the author chooses to include, what they choose to omit, and what tone they use when describing alternatives. Return to the earlier example. The city raised parking fees. Downtown businesses reported fewer walk-in customers. A reader can comprehend this literally and infer a suggested connection. Critical comprehension asks, is the author claiming that the fee increase caused the decline? Or merely noting an association? Are they claiming the policy was a mistake or just reporting consequences? You should be able to name the claim in a sentence that includes its strength. The author suggests the fee increase contributed to fewer walk-in customers is different from the author proves the fee increase caused fewer walk-in customers. Most arguments collapse at this step because readers accidentally upgrade suggests into proves or downgrade argues into mentions. Next critical question. What reasons or evidence does the author provide, and are they the right kind for the claim? In earlier sections, you practiced noticing signal words like because, therefore, however, and although. Now you use those hinges to inspect the structure. When the author says because, do they give you evidence or do they give you an assertion in the shape of an explanation? When they say, for example, is the example representative or cherry-picked? When they use a statistic, is it attached to a clear source and a clear comparison, or is it a number floating in the air? Many readers, including educated adults, confuse vividness with evidence. An anecdote feels persuasive because it is easy to imagine, but a single story rarely tells you what is typical. If an article argues that a school policy is failing and offers one dramatic classroom scene, critical comprehension asks the following. Is this scene representative? How would we know? What would count as stronger evidence? A careful reader can appreciate a story as an illustration without treating it as proof. A related question is about scope. Do the reasons match the size of the conclusion? A modest set of facts can support a modest conclusion. It cannot support a sweeping one. If the author observes a short-term change and concludes a permanent trend, you should feel the gap. You practiced this earlier when you learned to respect qualifiers like may, often, and for some people, under these conditions. Critical comprehension is where you ask whether the author's qualifiers are appropriate or performative. Sometimes writers use cautious language while still pushing you emotionally towards certainty. Other times, they overclaim with confident language because it sells. Your job is not to reward confidence. Your job is to measure fit. Does the certainty of the conclusion match the strength of the support? Another critical question. What assumptions are doing the hidden work? This is where inferential comprehension becomes a tool for evaluation. You already learned to say, because the author said X and Y, it suggests Z. Now you go one step deeper. For X and Y to justify Z, the author must be assuming A. Those assumptions may be reasonable, controversial, or false, but you cannot evaluate the argument until you can name them. Imagine a policy memo that says, remote work increases productivity because employees report fewer interruptions. An assumption hides inside that because fewer interruptions lead to higher productivity for this kind of work, and self-reports are a reliable measure of productivity. Another assumption might be that what counts as productivity is measurable in the same way across roles. A critical reader does not merely react, remote work is good, or remote work is bad. The reader pulls the hidden beams into view and asks if they hold. Sometimes the assumption is moral or definitional. If a writer argues, this reform is fair because it treats everyone the same, the assumption is that fairness means sameness. Another writer might assume fairness means meeting different needs differently. These two people can cite the same facts and disagree because they are operating with different definitions of fairness. Critical comprehension requires you to spot when a disagreement is about facts, when it is about values, and when it is about word meanings. Another essential question, what is missing, and what would I need to know to be confident? This is where critical comprehension becomes a form of intellectual humility rather than intellectual swagger. A weak version of spotting what's missing is performative skepticism. They didn't mention everything, therefore it's biased. A strong version is specific. They claim parking fees caused fewer customers, but they did not discuss other changes during the same period, like construction, weather, a new shopping center. or broader economic shifts. To be confident, I'd want comparisons to similar areas or data across longer time spans. Notice the difference. The strong version does not use missing information as a cheap way to dismiss. It uses missing information to map the boundary of what the text can support. This is one of the most practical outcomes of critical reading. You become better at knowing what you know and what you do not. Now add a question that many readers avoid because it feels uncomfortable. What is my own angle here, and how might it distort my reading? Earlier, you saw how biased inference can quietly steer two readers to opposite motives from the same sentence. Critical comprehension makes that bias explicit. When you feel a surge of agreement or disagreement, treat it like a signal. Ask, what belief of mine is being activated? This is not an invitation to distrust yourself in general. It is an invitation to stop confusing your first reaction with the final verdict. A practical habit is to write two brief reactions side by side. If the author is right, then, and if the author is wrong, then. For many topics, especially civic and professional ones, your mind wants to rush to one side. This practice forces you to keep both possibilities alive long enough to evaluate. It is also a way of protecting yourself from the illusion that intelligence equals speed. In reading, speed often just means you decided quickly, not that you decided well. All of this might sound like it turns reading into endless doubt. It does not have to. Critical comprehension is not the refusal to conclude. It is the ability to conclude responsibly. Sometimes the best conclusion is, this is well supported. I will tentatively accept it. Sometimes it is, this is plausible but under-evidenced. I will treat it as a hypothesis. Sometimes it is, this is rhetorically strong but logically weak. I will not grant it belief without better support. Sometimes it is, this is outside my knowledge. I need to learn more before I can judge. That last conclusion is not a failure. It is a high-level reading outcome. One of the biggest dangers for adult readers is believing they must have an immediate opinion about everything they read. The internet rewards instant verdicts. Critical reading does not. Critical reading rewards the ability to pause, represent, infer, evaluate, and sometimes leave a claim open. So the three layers form a ladder, and you climb it in order. First, what does the text say precisely without distortion? Second, what does it imply, with disciplined tethering to the clues? Third, what should I make of it, with fair tests of evidence, assumptions, scope, and missing information, while also watching the distortions I bring to the page? In the chapters ahead, this third layer will become more concrete. You will learn frameworks for evaluating arguments, for recognizing perspective, and for avoiding the failure modes where criticism becomes cynicism or tribalism. But the foundation is here. Critical comprehension is the decision point of reading. It is where words stop being merely understood and begin to be judged. It is where literacy becomes adulthood. GlobalSovereignUniversity.org. Here in the re-edification section, you can see the video and become a learner. Study this learning skill using GSU's game system, which we call gamification. Learn by playing. Let Global Sovereign University's AI tutor, whose name is GENO, help you to understand, to learn, and if you wish, to master this material. There is a certification process and so much more. Available for you at your convenience, GENO speaks 32 languages and understands 70 languages. Your one-on-one tutor at zero expense to you. Yes, everything at Global Sovereign University is free. No login, no ads, no expense. Thank you for listening.